Now make yourself at home. Perhaps a glass of Bordeaux? I have the 82 Chateau de Tour and a rather indifferent Rosan Segler.
I've been in prison, Cecil. I'll be happy just as long as it doesn't taste like orange drink fermented under a radiator.
That would be the Latour, then.
Certain hobbies and areas of knowledge can identify a person's socioeconomic status, but not always. In Frasier, the two brothers show interest in the classics like their mom did. However, their dad Marty is a blue-collar cop and is more interested in football and enjoys a good beer. It's played more for laughs, but there are times it causes tension. Certain characteristics, like the created mid-Atlantic accent Frasier has, gives a sense of being high-class and educated. It's mostly American, but there's just enough British blended in to sound smug. Historically, the southern and midwestern regions of the US have been poorer, and movies like Forrest Gump and Deliverance certainly don't help to refute that stereotype. This video certainly won't encompass all the complexities, but art, literature, music should be accessible to everyone regardless of background and socioeconomic status. Just because one person adores Of Mice and Men by Steinbeck, while another person enjoys being lost in the romance novels by Danielle Steele, doesn't mean that one of these people is inherently smarter or classier than the other. When Shakespeare's plays were performed in the Globe Theatre, the audience was full of the rich and the poor, the educated and the non-educated alike. Compare this to now, and if someone has read all the works of Shakespeare, an unspoken assumption is that they are likely smart and cultured. This shift of something being considered part of the rich culture or part of the poor culture changes over time and in some instances is exploited. If we oversimplify this into a soundbite, what is classy if you're rich but trashy if you're poor? There are countless memes that point out everything from speaking multiple languages, collecting versus hoarding, day drinking versus alcoholic, and more. For example, having an extensive vocabulary is usually not associated with the poor. Whenever it does appear, it's usually to point out that they overcame their background or they're an anomaly. This is subverted in shows like Letterkenney. The cold open is often Wayne displaying his amazing ability to articulate his astounding alliteration and abundant vocabulary while artistically enunciating his ardent appreciation for all things Letterkenney.
Don't you dare dawdle dilly-dally your dick around after dark in December. She's definitely damn drafty if you're down a duvet.
Easily.
Each and every earthling's environmentally enslaved.
In the linked article from libraryjournal.com, 21% of adults in the US, roughly 43 million, fall into the illiterate or functionally illiterate category, which is below a 5th grade reading level. Not only that, but of that category, 43% live in poverty. The reason for pointing this out is that illiteracy affects the stories and media we consume and feeds into the culture of if someone is poor or rich. In shows like Trailer Park Boys, Ricky is often mispronouncing certain words like jalapeno as jalapeno, saying WD-30 instead of WD-40, or saying Hannibal Lecter instead of Hannibal Lecter. It's played for laughs, but at the same time it feeds into this concept that lacking education means lacking intelligence and likely lacking money.
You sure there's enough plants to fill the order, though? Oh, yeah, big time. Did all the calculations myself. What?
Oh, no offense, Ricky, but you stopped going to math in grade 6.
It's not really math. 30,000 balls, 1 gram per bottle is 30,000 grams, 454 grams in a pound. You need about 66 pounds, about a quarter pound per plant. 264 plants. We're gonna grow 350 just to be safe.
While Ricky doesn't have book learning in the stereotypical sense, when he needs to use math for their business, he can perform calculations in his head. In the French-Canadian series that is translated into Can You Hear Me?, Ada is dating Nassim, who is currently a student at the university. In season 1, he invites her to play ping pong, then makes a comment that she plays like Serena Williams. Ada doesn't know who that is, and he just says never mind and continues back to the game. The difference in education levels affect the relationship in season 2, but he doesn't look down on her. Let's consider public schools specifically. It's probably not a surprise that nearly 80% of students in private school are not poor families. 2 books that were common in many public schools in my area during high school were John Knoll's A Separate Peace and J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. I never really connected with Catcher in the Rye, and academically, I understand why others see it as a classic, even though I disagree. As far as A Separate Peace, I'm going to borrow from 10 Things I Hate About You in that I hate reading this book with the fiery passion of 10,000 Suns.
Although I hardly consider a separate piece the 9th grade level.
Yeah, more like preschool.
I hate John Knowles.
Me too.
It felt very male-centric, and it was a boring read. If you like either of these books, no judgment, just difference of opinion. In the 2016 article, Where's Literature's Class Diversity?, it almost breaches the topic why the voices of those in poverty are often invisible in the writing world. Sure, writing can be a cheap activity, but if you're working 50 hours a week or exhausted between split shifts, how much of our time do we want to spend on writing, assuming we can? Not to say that this doesn't happen, but many of us are exhausted at the end of the day or have other pressing issues. It can be difficult to see progress, and even if we do complete a work, there is the next set of difficulties in getting it published, edited, and printed. Then if you want paid, you have to navigate through those waters. There's also that illiteracy issue previously mentioned. One thing the article focuses on is how the picture we have of writers often showcases those few that are successful and how they live now, rather than the uphill climb or the countless authors who didn't get published for whatever reason. And if we only focus on those select few that were able to make it, it can skew the reality of what it's really like to be a writer. When it comes to stories about the wealthy, it's a love-hate balance. On one hand, it's an escape from our current world, and who wants to read about the constant trials of a family that has an unhappy ending? But at the end of the day, we need the voices and perspectives of people from a variety of backgrounds, not to mention the lack of voices from other marginalized groups and the difficulties that they face as well. One way that media such as classical literature can be made more accessible is through adaptations that modernize language or situations. To name a few, O Brother, Where Art Thou is influenced by Homer's epic poem The Odyssey and takes place in the South during the Depression. Chirac is an adaptation of Aristophanes' Greek play Lysistrata that takes place in Chicago amidst gang violence. Shakespeare's plays have been adapted into countless movies, such as The Taming of the Shrew and 10 Things I Hate About You, and Twelfth Night and She's the Man. That's not even touching on how many variations of Romeo and Juliet exist. Quality of adaptations aside, these movies are more likely to reach a wider audience of people from different backgrounds. If there's a choice between a traditional interpretation of Romeo and Juliet or seeing Jet Li kick butt, I'd rather watch Romeo Must Die. Just because a classic piece of literature is adapted to something modern doesn't mean that its impact is completely gone. It might even draw us to be more motivated to read the original piece. While the juxtaposition of different educational backgrounds on shows like Frasier can be entertaining, in reality that difference isn't always fun to live through. In Spork, the main character is cruelly teased for many reasons. She is poor, she is awkward, she lives in a trailer, she is intersex, she has big frizzy hair. She's also teased because she loves the movie The Wiz, which is an adaptation of the classic movie The Wizard of Oz. In the Stacker article linked below, The Wiz is categorized as number 45 in the 50 worst movie remakes, while The Wizard of Oz is ranked as the 11th greatest movie of all time, according to the Greatest Films website. Part of this is due to the fact that The Wiz is a remake, but there's also the aspect that the cast is mostly people of color. Movie ranking lists like these are subjective and have several biases and other issues. Is it a bad thing if Spork prefers the adaptation? She still understands the core of the story. Another example is Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper. Again, many adaptations play on this concept of switching places. Usually it's to highlight the differences in the lives of the uber wealthy and the poor. A large portion of the story is how both characters are struggling to fit into their new surroundings. Trying to fit into a different work environment is tough, especially if it isn't something taught in school or gleaned from the experiences of those around us. Which topics are taboo or how to act during team meetings is not innate knowledge for many of us. Working in a retail environment is vastly different than a corporate office. In Superstore, Amy starts as one of the floor employees and eventually lands a corporate position. The show does have some instances of the struggles she faces, and at the end of the series, she mentions that apparently once you get a corporate job, it's easy to find another corporate job. And that's part of the problem. How are we going to get more voices from different backgrounds if there isn't an opportunity for many of them to get to a place where they can have a voice? Yes, Amy worked her way up in a sense, But there were also instances of luck that just happened to work out for her, and that can't be ignored. In The Prince and the Pauper, the prince dies at a young age, while the pauper lives to be an old man. However, with how health insurance works in the US, it's more likely that the opposite is true. Sometimes the voice of the poor becomes background noise. The struggle of the poor might be softened by music, the story might be set far in the past, or even take place in another country. Les Mis and Oliver are stories about the working poor struggling to survive. I'm not saying that we can't enjoy the music, but maybe take a step back and think about the lyrics and what's behind them. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle was pointing out the many flaws in a system that chewed up and spit out its workers. However, after his book was published, there was more outrage and effort put towards fixing food industry standards.
You name it, the American marketplace sells it. It's good food, and there's plenty of it. We also have drugs that are safe and effective against all kinds of ailments and disease. And these, well, they're secret weapons to make us all beautiful people. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the law that has made the American marketplace the best in the world.
It's part of the reason the Food and Drug Administration exists. While this certainly needed to happen, once again, the voice of the Lithuanian immigrant family struggling to live in Chicago is overshadowed. The article in Wikipedia mentions that when Lewis was trying to publish the book, part of it had to be censored to appeal to the more capitalist nature of the publishers. It also mentions that there was a film version made in 1914 but was lost, which isn't uncommon as many movies from the silent film era were lost or destroyed. There is a very short article from 2011 that mentions David Schwimmer was going to try and make an adaptation, but funny how that didn't work out. To put it another way, it would be like writing a story that revolved around a family that all worked at a particularly large warehouse in an effort to point out that it's unsustainable and detrimental to the physical and mental health of workers, only to have people ignore that and instead be enraged at how the local ecosystem is destroyed. Both are valid concerns, but one of these is certainly going to get more attention and funding than the other. Sinclair Lewis managed to publish books that gave a voice to people that were overlooked. An additional tidbit, this is also the same author of Oil, the inspiration for the movie There Will Be Blood. Emphasis on inspiration. Having read the book and watched the movie, calling it an adaptation would be a stretch. And again, in this movie, the plight of the working poor is a footnote and takes a back seat to the other themes. But what about original stories that aren't adapted from classical literature or stories that didn't take place a century ago? If it's about the poor, it can be exploitative. James Dickey's novel Deliverance was adapted into a movie 2 years after it was published in 1970. In the 2018 documentary Hillbilly, there's a section about Billy Redden, who played the banjo player in Deliverance. He says, quote, "I'd like to have all the money I thought I'd make from this movie. I wouldn't be working in Walmart right now, and I'm struggling really hard to make ends meet," end quote. Deliverance was the top 5th grossing movie in 1972, but because it had all these negative connotations, it wasn't completely positive for those outside Hollywood living in Rabun County, Georgia. While filming a movie might bring in money to the local community, it comes at a cost, and it doesn't always help the people that live there as much as we think it will. In the Marketplace article from 2012 linked below, because of the reputation from this movie, some of the people from Rabun County lost job opportunities because of the stereotypes it perpetuated. I mean, Billy Redden is working at Walmart. According to the US Census Bureau, in 2019, before the pandemic, 13% of this county lived in poverty, and the median individual income was $28,266 a year. So does it really matter if someone prefers to watch Easy A or would rather read The Scarlet Letter? My theory is that part of this is rooted in a generation that was pressured to obtain a 4-year degree. Mike Rowe hosts the show Dirty Jobs that shows people in all sorts of occupations that don't require this type of secondary education.
There was a time when higher education needed a PR campaign, and it got one. Unfortunately, the push for 4-year institutions came at the expense of community colleges, trade schools, and apprenticeship programs. Thus, every other educational opportunity began to feel subordinate.
This push for education, I think, created a division, a more competitive nature to appear more cultured or knowledgeable than the background we came from.
With the universal push for a 4-year degree more intense than ever, I argued then that our skills gap is the direct result of a mistaken belief that the best path for the most people is a 4-year degree. And I concluded with another appeal to aggressively confront the stigmas and stereotypes that discourage people from entering the trades, along with the challenge to guidance counselors to present a more balanced presentation of educational alternatives beyond high school.
And really, at the end of the day, there's a chance we'll all end up working at the same coffee shop.
Syrups, powders, whipped cream is right here. You ever work with one of these?
I think I can handle it. I went to Wharton.
Well, I went to Harvard.
And I went to Juvie. And we're all here wearing an apron.
Considering the difficulties in pursuing a college degree, especially for those who are poor, part of a marginalized group, or both, now seems like a good time to reevaluate the literature and media included in our education. I'll start with my 2 suggestions and even throw in a third that could be eliminated. Until next time.
I am Springfield's Chief Hydrological and Hydrodynamical Engineer.
Hydrological and hydrodynamical. Talk about running the gamut.
Snigger all you like, Bob.
Thank you. I believe I shall.
But I suppose I should thank you. After all, it led me to my true calling.
Cecil, no civilization in history has ever considered Chief Hydrological Engineer a calling. Yes, the Cappadocians, fine.